What if the last phone call you ever made wasn't just a routine conversation, but a cryptic warning? Imagine hearing words that would make your blood run cold, only to realize later that they might have been the key to understanding something far more disturbing. That was reportedly the final message from Rob Reiner, the celebrated Hollywood director known for films that shaped generations. A man whose work touched millions, whose voice in politics carried weight, and whose family life, from the outside, appeared stable and private, left behind a line that has since sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. If anything happens to me, don't trust the silence around it. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Those words were not made public immediately. In fact, they circulated quietly among close friends and associates for days before anyone dared to mention them. But the very fact that such a warning exists raises questions that nobody in the public eye has answered. Why would a man like Rob Reiner, 78 years old, leave a message like this? And why did the timing of it, the suddenness of the tragedy that followed, make it feel like a premonition? The story that unfolded over that fateful Sunday in Los Angeles is one that combines sudden loss, shocking arrests, and a cloud of mystery that refuses to dissipate. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, 68, were pronounced dead at their home in one of LA's most exclusive neighborhoods. For a man who spent decades in the public eye, whose career oscillated between comedy, drama, and political commentary, the silence surrounding their deaths felt unnatural, almost eerie. The public absorbed the news with disbelief, and within hours, speculation began to spread like wildfire. Then came the arrest of their son, Nick Reiner. Instantly, the media had a narrative, a simple storyline that offered closure to a grieving public, a tragic family tragedy. But anyone familiar with Hollywood, or with high-profile families in general, knows that the simplest explanations are rarely the true ones. Why? Because real life is messy, filled with contradictions, secrets, and whispers that never make it into print. And in this case, the cryptic warning left by Rob Reiner has ensured that no one can accept a straightforward narrative without questioning it. Let's rewind for a moment. Who was Rob Reiner outside the headlines and beyond the film credits? He was the director of iconic films like This Is Spinal Tap, The Princess Bride, and When Harry Met Sally. He was a storyteller, a master of weaving humor and drama into narratives that resonated universally. But he was also a man deeply involved in political activism, often speaking out on controversial topics, sometimes making enemies along the way. And despite his public persona, his family life was reportedly private, shielded from the relentless scrutiny of the media. Which is why the events that unfolded struck so sharply. Because they exposed a fragility, a vulnerability that few could have anticipated. Now, let's focus on the night in question. It was a Sunday evening, typical for Los Angeles. The city was alive with its usual hum, traffic, chatter, and neon lights reflecting off the streets. Inside the Reiner residence, however, something was unfolding that would leave an indelible mark on everyone connected to the family. According to early reports, the house was quiet, unassuming, almost like any other well-maintained property in the area. But behind closed doors, tragedy struck. The precise details remain tightly guarded by authorities, but the key fact is inescapable. Both Rob and Michelle were found dead in their home, shocking friends, family, and fans alike. It's hard to overstate the shock that rippled through Hollywood. Tributes poured in from actors, directors, and public figures. Social media buzzed with disbelief. And yet, amid the outpouring of grief, there was an undercurrent of unease. Friends and insiders hinted at things they couldn't say publicly. Some reported strange phone calls, cryptic messages, moments that didn't make sense, details that painted a picture of someone who might have sensed danger long before the tragedy. And central to that was Rob Reiner's final phone call, a message that has become the fulcrum of speculation. What exactly did he say? The line, "If anything happens to me, don't trust the silence around it," is simple in words but profound in implication. It suggests forewarning, a recognition that circumstances might arise where appearances could be deceiving. For a man who spent his life crafting narratives, directing actors, and telling audiences how to see the truth on screen, it's chilling to consider him leaving behind a warning about the real world, a warning not about fiction, but about life itself. The public rarely sees the private side of celebrities, and it's in this space, the unobserved corners of their lives, where mysteries often grow. Consider this: a director known for films with intricate plots, a wife who was private but supportive, and a son whose life, until recently, had not drawn headlines of this magnitude. What could have happened that would prompt such a message? And why has no one in authority clarified the meaning behind it? It's important here to pause and reflect on the role of silence. Silence can be comforting, reassuring even, but in certain contexts, it becomes dangerous. Rob Reiner's warning was about this very silence, the absence of explanation, the lack of transparency, the quiet that follows sudden, shocking events. Think about that for a moment. When tragedy strikes and silence descends, what are you meant to believe? And more importantly, what are you meant to question? The story is not only about death. It is about patterns, about human behavior, about what happens when powerful individuals leave clues but the world around them fails to recognize them. There are layers here: the immediate shock of loss, the media narrative that follows, the speculation about family dynamics, and the unanswered questions that linger in the shadows. Each layer builds on the previous one, and as we peel them back, the complexity and drama of this story become apparent. But let's not forget Michelle Reiner. Often overshadowed by Rob's public persona, Michelle was a crucial figure in this story. Those who knew her described her as quietly formidable, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her family. Her presence adds another layer of mystery. A partner in life whose sudden death alongside her husband only deepens the sense that something extraordinary, and perhaps sinister, was at play. And then there is Nick Reiner, their son. Arrested in connection with their deaths, Nick has become the focus of both media scrutiny and public curiosity. Yet even here, contradictions arise. Reports vary, details shift, and timelines conflict. What was Nick's relationship with his parents in the weeks leading up to the tragedy? What tensions, if any, were present that might have escalated in ways the public cannot yet see? And crucially, how does Rob Reiner's final warning fit into this puzzle? Was it a premonition, a coded message, or simply a cryptic line taken out of context? We are left, then, with the same question that likely haunted everyone who heard that final phone call. What did Rob Reiner know that the rest of us do not? And why did he feel the need to issue a warning about silence itself? Perhaps it was instinct, a gut feeling honed by decades in Hollywood, a place where appearances are everything and truth is often obscured. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something more personal, rooted in knowledge that remains inaccessible to the public eye. As we dive into the details of this story, keep one thing in mind. Every answer seems to lead to more questions. Every reported fact contains contradictions. Every statement from friends, family, or authorities carries subtext. The narrative that emerges is not linear. It is layered, fractured, and often contradictory. And that, perhaps, is exactly what Rob Reiner intended when he left his final message. By the end of this hour-long journey, you will know more than most people about the events leading up to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the circumstances surrounding the last phone call, and the unresolved questions that continue to haunt Hollywood insiders. But even as you watch, the sense of unease will grow, because what seemed like closure may in fact be only the beginning. And now, consider this. The warning was not just about a single moment. It was about patterns, behaviors, and the environment surrounding the Reiners. If anything happened, do not trust the silence. That statement alone reframes every piece of information you think you know about this story. It challenges assumptions, and it forces you to question what you accept as truth. So, as we step forward into the first chapter, ask yourself, if a man like Rob Reiner felt compelled to leave such a warning, what did he see that no one else did? And more importantly, what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming? What if an ordinary evening turned into a moment that froze time for everyone involved? That's exactly what happened the night Rob and Michelle Reiner were found dead in their Los Angeles home. For a family that had always maintained a level of privacy rare in Hollywood, the suddenness of the tragedy was incomprehensible. Neighbors who had seen the couple hundreds of times described the scene as normal, only hours before the discovery, and yet within a matter of hours, their lives, and the perception of everything around them, would be irrevocably changed. The night began like any other Sunday in the city. The streets humming with activity, neon reflections bouncing off slick asphalt, the soft drone of traffic in the distance. Inside the Reiner residence, however, a series of events unfolded that no one would have predicted. According to initial reports, the couple had spent the day quietly, performing everyday tasks, answering calls, and managing household affairs. No indication of impending tragedy had been reported by friends or family. But by late evening, the home that had once been a sanctuary had transformed into the center of a shocking narrative. Consider the details that emerged first: a call to authorities reporting the deaths. The dispatcher would later recount the tension in the voice of the caller, a friend, or perhaps a staff member whose identity has not been fully disclosed. Authorities arrived to find both Rob and Michelle deceased, with circumstances that immediately raised questions. How could a couple, appearing so stable and normal, suddenly meet such an abrupt end? Even before the investigation officially began, the public had already begun piecing together fragments of a story, fragments that often contradicted each other. One of the most chilling aspects of that night was the silence that followed. In a house filled with memories, laughter, and decades of life, the absence of sound was almost deafening. For those familiar with the Reiners' daily routines, this silence was unnatural. Friends reported not hearing from them in hours when a casual text or call would normally have been expected. That silence, ironically, is exactly what Rob had warned about in his final phone call. If anything happens to me, don't trust the silence around it. As investigators began their work, the timeline of events quickly became central to the unfolding mystery. Law enforcement sources have been careful with specifics, but public reporting indicates that the discovery occurred sometime late in the evening. How long had the bodies been there before being found? And why had nobody close to the family noticed anything amiss sooner? These questions, seemingly simple, are far from straightforward. They point to a larger puzzle, one in which every detail must be scrutinized and every assumption challenged. It's worth pausing to consider the psychological impact on those who were first on the scene. Neighbors, staff, and friends all describe a mix of shock, disbelief, and confusion. One individual reportedly froze at the threshold, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Another described a profound sense of unrealness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. This is not uncommon in situations of sudden death, especially among families in the public eye. But in the Reiners' case, there was an additional layer of foreboding: the knowledge that Rob had issued a warning that was cryptic but unmistakable. From a narrative perspective, the night itself is almost cinematic. The city outside remained alive, oblivious to the tragedy inside one of its mansions. Lights flickered on and off as people went about their routines. Somewhere nearby, traffic hummed, a television droned in the background, and yet in the Reiner household, something had changed forever. This contrast, normal life continuing while an extraordinary event unfolds, is part of what makes the story so haunting. It is also part of why the cryptic warning left by Rob resonates so strongly. By now, attention had begun to shift to the Reiners' immediate family, particularly their son, Nick. Details about his whereabouts that evening remain sparse, and the initial reporting has left gaps that the public instinctively wants filled. What role did Nick play in the final hours of that night? Was he in the house, nearby, or elsewhere? And crucially, how does his presence, or absence, fit with Rob Reiner's warning about silence? Every detail about timing, movement, and communication becomes a thread in a complex web that investigators and observers alike are desperate to untangle. Consider, too, the impact on Hollywood. Rob Reiner is not just any director. He is a cultural icon. His films have been part of the public consciousness for decades. To see someone of his stature suddenly enveloped in tragedy shocks more than just family and friends. It reverberates through a community that understands, perhaps better than most, the fragility of life behind the camera, away from public appearances, and outside the curated images of social media. The shockwaves of that night extended far beyond Los Angeles. One of the most intriguing aspects of the night is what we may never fully know: the private interactions that occurred hours before the deaths were discovered. Rob's final phone call, for example, is rumored to have taken place during this period. Who did he call? What was said? And why did he feel compelled to leave a message that essentially cautioned against accepting silence at face value? Each of these questions deepens the mystery. And for those attempting to reconstruct the night, it is a critical point. That call might be the key to understanding everything that followed. In addition to family dynamics, there is the matter of the home itself. Reports describe it as a stately residence, well-maintained, reflecting the couple's taste and lifestyle. Yet even in a house that outwardly appears secure and orderly, something went profoundly wrong. Was it a matter of external influence, internal conflict, or something entirely unforeseen? Observers note that in cases like this, the smallest detail, a misplaced item, an unusual sound, an overlooked message, can become pivotal. And in this story, there is no shortage of details that seem, at first glance, inconsequential, but could ultimately reshape our understanding of that night. It is also important to consider the emotional environment. Rob and Michelle Reiner were reportedly close, devoted to one another and to their family. But even in relationships that appear stable, tensions can exist beneath the surface. Were there signs of stress, disagreements, or unspoken fears that those closest to them noticed? Did Rob's warning relate to these subtler dynamics? Or was it pointing towards something external, something outside of the family? The answer is elusive, and that uncertainty is what makes the story compelling, even terrifying. As authorities began their work, the initial focus was on establishing facts, the time of death, the cause, and the sequence of events. But beyond the technical investigation lies the human element. Friends, neighbors, and associates all trying to reconcile their memory of the couple with the reality of their deaths. Many have admitted that even now, days later, they struggle to process what happened. The shock, coupled with Rob Reiner's final cryptic warning, creates a tension that will not easily dissipate. By the end of that night, a narrative had begun to form, one that would dominate headlines and social media feeds alike. Rob Reiner and Michelle were gone. Nick Reiner had emerged as a figure of interest, and a single, chilling warning hung in the background. Don't trust the silence around it. This phrase, at once simple and profound, transformed what might have been an ordinary tragic report into a story laden with suspicion, unanswered questions, and the sense that the surface of the truth barely scratches the real events of that evening. So consider this. An ordinary Sunday evening becomes extraordinary in ways no one can predict. Silence follows tragedy, and a cryptic message lingers, demanding attention. The world sees a family destroyed, a son implicated, and a Hollywood icon lost. But beneath the headlines, there is a story that no one has fully told. That story is what we are about to explore in detail, piece by piece, fact by fact, rumor by rumor. And just as the night itself concluded with finality for the Reiners, it also left questions unanswered, questions that will lead us deeper into a world of secrets, tensions, and warnings that nobody could ignore. Because the most unsettling realization is this: what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if a single phone call could hold the key to everything that followed? Imagine, for a moment, a conversation that was brief, almost casual on the surface, yet carried a weight that no one could ignore, a warning wrapped in ordinary words. According to sources close to the Reiners, this was the final call Rob Reiner made before tragedy struck. It was not a farewell. It was not mundane. It was a message designed to be heard, remembered, and, if necessary, decoded. The circumstances surrounding the call are shrouded in secrecy. Who received it? That question alone has sparked speculation among journalists, insiders, and fans alike. Some reports suggest it was a close family friend. Others hint it might have been a trusted associate in Hollywood. The exact content of the conversation remains partially undisclosed, but the phrase that has emerged, "If anything happens to me, don't trust the silence around it," has been verified by multiple sources. Every word of that line carries weight, but the delivery, the tone, and the context are what make it truly haunting. Consider the implications. Rob Reiner was a man whose life revolved around stories, crafting them, directing them, understanding their twists and turns. He knew how to signal without revealing, to hint without spelling everything out. This phone call was more than just words. It was a narrative in miniature. It suggested anticipation, a foresight of events that might unfold in a way that was both shocking and incomprehensible. For anyone who knew Rob, even casually, the warning was unmistakable. It demanded attention, reflection, and, most importantly, action. Let's break down why this call is so significant. First, the timing. It reportedly occurred in the hours leading up to the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths. That means whatever he communicated could have had immediate relevance to the events that followed. Second, the content. A simple directive to distrust silence is cryptic yet intentional. It implies awareness of hidden factors, forces, motives, or circumstances that could be obscured from plain view. Third, the context. Rob Reiner, the director, the storyteller, and political commentator, rarely spoke cryptically without reason. If he felt compelled to issue a warning like this, it suggests he saw something others did not. Now imagine being on the receiving end of that call. A trusted friend hears these words, senses urgency, but cannot fully grasp the implications. They might dismiss it as overcaution or eccentricity, especially considering Rob's history as a careful, deliberate, and somewhat theatrical communicator. But in hindsight, every phrase takes on new significance. Every pause, every inflection becomes a potential clue, a breadcrumb leading to a truth that may never be fully revealed. This is where the story becomes complicated. How do you interpret a message when the messenger is no longer available to clarify? How do you act on a warning that is deliberately ambiguous, yet undeniably serious? Rob Reiner's final call sits at the intersection of grief, speculation, and fear. It forces everyone involved, family, friends, authorities, to consider possibilities they might have otherwise ignored. And it creates a tension that builds with every passing hour, every headline, every unconfirmed rumor. Adding to the mystery is the fact that the phone call was reportedly not widely disclosed at first. Why? Because revealing it too soon could influence investigations, spark public hysteria, or complicate media narratives. Hollywood insiders whispered about it. Friends exchanged knowing glances, and the media began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the early reports. Every detail of the night, from the sequence of events to who was present, was scrutinized, and the call emerged as a critical piece of the puzzle that didn't fit neatly into any official narrative. It's also worth noting that the content of the call reflects a broader theme in high-profile tragedies: the tension between public perception and private knowledge. Rob Reiner, as a cultural figure, lived in a world where appearances mattered. Yet here, in the most private of spaces, a phone conversation, he spoke plainly, without concern for optics. The message was meant to transcend the public gaze, to communicate something essential to those who could understand. It was a private warning with public consequences. But what exactly did he foresee? The words themselves suggest more than just caution. They hint at inevitability. "Don't trust the silence" implies that things happening quietly, deaths, absences, delays, or unexplained events, may not be as straightforward as they seem. In other words, Rob Reiner was telling someone that the world around them could be deceiving, that appearances would be misleading, and that truth might only be found if one refused to accept silence at face value. Contrast this with the public reporting in the immediate aftermath. Headlines focused on shock, tragedy, and arrests. Media narratives sought to simplify a complex situation into digestible pieces. But insiders, those with closer access, recognized the dissonance. The phone call didn't fit into any conventional story. It suggested foresight, awareness, and perhaps even fear. And it hinted at questions nobody was yet willing or able to ask. Think about the ripple effect of that call. If the recipient acted immediately, could anything have changed? If they hesitated, ignored it, or misinterpreted it, what consequences followed? The tension between action and inaction is central to this narrative. It is not just a story about what happened, but about what might have been prevented and what warnings were left unheeded. Adding another layer is the mystery of motive and intention. Rob Reiner was known for his activism and involvement in political discourse. He had friends, colleagues, and associates across Hollywood and Washington. Could his warning have related to something external, perhaps connected to his broader engagements? Or was it deeply personal, rooted in family dynamics that the public could never fully comprehend? Every angle, every possibility, adds depth and complexity to the unfolding story. The phone call also raises a critical question about communication. How do you convey urgency without creating panic? How do you hint at danger without exposing yourself or others? Rob Reiner, with decades of experience managing narratives, understood this balance. The call's ambiguity was deliberate, a measure to protect the listener while still imparting essential information. Yet that same ambiguity creates frustration, tension, and curiosity for everyone now piecing the story together. And then there's the emotional impact. For those who heard the call, the weight of its meaning only grew with time. The words took on new resonance after the deaths were discovered. What once might have seemed cautionary became haunting. The fear embedded in the call, subtle but unmistakable, now lingers as a ghost over the entire narrative. Listeners are left questioning everything: the timeline, the events leading up to the tragedy, and the silence that followed. In a broader sense, this phone call is emblematic of a recurring theme in tragedies that touch high-profile individuals: the final warning. History is full of moments where a last message, cryptic, urgent, or ambiguous, becomes a pivotal clue in understanding what happened. In this case, the warning was delivered in a way that only those closest to Rob could appreciate, yet its existence reverberates far beyond the immediate circle. The importance of this call cannot be overstated. It is a lens through which every subsequent event must be viewed. From the discovery of the bodies to the arrest of Nick Reiner, the call provides context, a frame that forces reconsideration of what appears obvious. And it serves as a reminder that in tragedies, details that seem minor at first, a word, a pause, a tone, can ultimately hold the key to understanding. Finally, consider the chilling possibility that Rob Reiner's foresight extended beyond this single call. Reports indicate that he had mentioned concerns to other friends and associates in subtle ways, hints that now, in retrospect, appear connected to the same overarching warning. The call is, in many ways, the visible tip of a hidden iceberg, a signal that something was amiss, something others could not yet grasp. And so, as the night ended and authorities began their work, the phone call stood out as a haunting prelude to the events that would unfold. It is a moment that encapsulates tension, anticipation, and unease. It is a reminder that sometimes, the most ordinary-seeming communications carry extraordinary significance. But the story does not end with the call itself. What followed next, in the hours and days after, would expose contradictions, unanswered questions, and mysteries that even Hollywood insiders struggle to reconcile. And those revelations would force everyone involved, from family to law enforcement, from friends to the public, to confront the possibility that the warning was not just a premonition, but a key to understanding a sequence of events that nobody saw coming. Why would a man like Rob Reiner, a filmmaker whose life revolved around crafting stories, leave a warning about silence? That phrase, "don't trust the silence around it," is not only cryptic, it is a puzzle. It is a line that demands attention, reflection, and interpretation. It raises immediate questions. What silence was he referring to? Why would it be dangerous to accept it at face value? And perhaps most importantly, what did he anticipate that would make silence so misleading? To understand the weight of this statement, we need to consider Rob Reiner's life and context. He was not just a director. He was a storyteller, a man who spent decades analyzing human behavior, social structures, and hidden motives. Films like this as Spinal Tap and The Princess Bride are more than entertainment. They are reflections of nuance, irony, and subtlety. Reiner's talent was seeing beneath the surface, understanding the unspoken dynamics between people, and conveying complexity in ways that audiences could digest without realizing the depth. That same skill, it seems, informed his final warning. Silence, in many ways, is deceptive. It can be comforting, a moment of peace, or it can be a tool of concealment. Rob's warning suggests he understood the latter. In the hours, and eventually days, surrounding his and Michelle's deaths, silence became not just absence, but a presence, a force that could mislead, confuse, or obscure the truth. Friends, family, and authorities would confront this silence repeatedly. Every unanswered question, every delay in communication, every official statement that felt incomplete, these became part of the very silence Rob had cautioned against. Think about the psychology of silence. In moments of crisis, silence can manipulate perception. People instinctively fill gaps with assumptions, often inaccurate ones. And when tragedy strikes, the human mind craves resolution, craving explanations even when facts are unavailable. Rob's warning taps into this dynamic. By alerting someone not to trust the silence, he effectively challenged the listener to question everything, to dig deeper, to remain vigilant in the face of uncertainty. It is a warning about both the world and human nature, about the dangers of accepting the story you are told without scrutiny. But the implications go even further. Consider the environment in which this warning was delivered: Hollywood. A world where appearances are meticulously managed, where narratives are carefully controlled, and where information is often weaponized. In such a space, silence is rarely accidental. It is deliberate, curated, and sometimes dangerous. Rob Reiner, fully aware of this, likely understood that a public narrative could form in ways that obscured reality. His warning about silence might have been as much about anticipating public perception as it was about immediate family or friends. Adding another layer is the familial dynamic. Rob and Michelle's son, Nick, is now central to this story. Without speculating irresponsibly, it is clear that family relationships, histories, and tensions cannot be ignored. Silence within a family can be particularly misleading. Words left unsaid, conflicts unaddressed, private fears unspoken. All of these contribute to a reality that outsiders cannot perceive. Rob's warning may have been rooted in this awareness, an acknowledgement that appearances within a household can be deceiving, and that danger is sometimes closer than it appears. The phrase also invites philosophical reflection. In life, silence is often treated as neutral. We equate quiet with calm, absence of noise with absence of trouble. But Rob's words invert this assumption. Here, silence is a signal, a warning, a clue. It suggests that what is not said is often as important, if not more important, than what is said. For investigators, journalists, and the public, this creates a complex puzzle. Every omission, every pause, every delay becomes a piece of evidence, potentially more telling than any statement. Rob's warning was not vague. The directive to "don't trust the silence" implies forethought, a strategic perspective. It suggests he anticipated a sequence of events that would unfold in ways others might misinterpret. The cautionary nature of the statement hints at danger, conflict, or manipulation. It is not a casual remark. It is, in essence, a prelude to understanding the events that followed. And as the timeline of that fateful Sunday and the days after unfolds, the resonance of this warning becomes clearer. Yet, as compelling as this warning is, it introduces contradictions. Public reporting suggests a straightforward narrative, a tragic family death followed by a rapid investigation. But the warning implies complexity. It implies that things are not as they seem, that official explanations might be incomplete or misleading. It forces anyone analyzing the case to entertain possibilities they might otherwise reject. And in doing so, it creates tension, a constant undercurrent of uncertainty that refuses to be resolved easily. Let's examine the potential scenarios the warning might refer to. First, the danger could have been external, threats from outside the family, forces beyond the Reiners' immediate control. Second, it could have been internal, family conflict, misunderstandings, or unspoken tensions that could escalate unexpectedly. Third, it could be a combination, the intersection of private vulnerabilities and public exposure. Rob's experience in Hollywood, combined with his awareness of human behavior, would have made him sensitive to all three possibilities. And the phrase "don't trust the silence" serves as a guide, urging vigilance across every angle. The emotional weight of this warning cannot be overstated. For those who knew Rob personally, it is more than just advice. It is a haunting echo of concern, a signal of foresight, and a lingering question that demands attention. Imagine hearing such a statement from someone you trust implicitly, knowing that it was delivered in the final hours of their life. The tension, fear, and sense of urgency it creates are difficult to overstate. It is the kind of warning that reshapes perception, that forces every subsequent action to be viewed through a lens of heightened scrutiny. Moreover, the warning introduces narrative uncertainty. In any story, Whether in Hollywood, literature, or real life, gaps create tension. Rob Reiner's directive ensures that these gaps are not ignored. The listener is compelled to pay attention, to notice what is missing, and to treat silence as a potential signal rather than absence. It is a masterclass in perception management, teaching someone to read between the lines, to see the unseen, and to question the obvious. There is also the broader social context to consider. When a public figure issues a warning like this, it extends beyond the immediate circle. It becomes a story, a talking point, a clue for outsiders trying to piece together the truth. And because it is cryptic, it naturally generates speculation. What did Rob know that others did not? Why did he feel the need to speak in code? And most importantly, what consequences did he anticipate that made such a warning necessary? But perhaps the most striking element is the human instinct that follows a warning of this nature. When someone tells you not to trust silence, your brain begins to overanalyze everything. Delayed messages, unreturned calls, unexplained absences, incomplete statements. Ordinary events suddenly take on significance. Every detail becomes potentially meaningful. And in the case of the Reiners, that instinctive suspicion has driven both public interest and investigative scrutiny. It has transformed a tragic family story into a complex, multi-layered mystery. Finally, consider the lasting effect of Rob's words. They linger like a shadow over every subsequent report, every news article, every statement from law enforcement. They force us to question the narrative, to examine motives, and to scrutinize timelines. They ensure that this story cannot be accepted at face value, that curiosity is necessary, and that closure is never simple. Silence, in this context, is no longer neutral. It is a presence, an active element in the story, and a constant reminder of the warning embedded in that final phone call. And as the investigation deepened, as the public absorbed each new detail, the phrase, "don't trust the silence," took on increasing relevance. Every unanswered question, every inconsistency, and every omission became a thread to follow. It is a guiding principle in understanding the Reiner tragedy, and it forces a reconsideration of everything that might have seemed straightforward in the early hours after their deaths. But what does this silence hide? And how does it connect to the events, decisions, and revelations that will follow? Those answers are not yet clear, and the deeper we dig, the more unsettling the story becomes. Because in the end, Rob Reiner's warning is not just about the past. It is about perception, about vigilance, and about the reality that what is left unsaid can be more dangerous than anything spoken aloud. Imagine a house filled with decades of memories, laughter, arguments, celebrations, and quiet everyday moments. A home that, to the outside world, seemed ordinary, even serene. Now imagine that same house transformed into the epicenter of a tragedy so shocking that it sent ripples across Hollywood and beyond. This is the house of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the place where life as they knew it came to an abrupt, incomprehensible halt. And yet, paradoxically, it was a house full of answers and none given. The Reiner residence was located in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods. From the outside, it appeared as a well-maintained, stately home, the kind of property where appearances matter and where privacy is fiercely guarded. Friends and neighbors often spoke of Rob and Michelle as private but warm, courteous but reserved. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Yet, as investigators would discover, the very walls of that house held clues, fragments of truth, that resisted easy interpretation. The initial discovery by authorities set the tone for the complex mystery that would follow. Both Rob and Michelle were pronounced dead inside the home. According to reports, the environment did not immediately reveal signs of forced entry or violent struggle, which only deepened the questions. How could two people in seemingly good health, living in a secure home, be found in such circumstances? The absence of obvious indicators of a struggle or crime suggested that the truth lay hidden in the details that were subtle, scattered, and sometimes contradictory. Step inside the house, and one begins to appreciate the paradox. Every corner, every room, every personal artifact is potentially significant. Family photos, personal effects, letters, and even mundane household items suddenly become part of the narrative. Investigators meticulously combed the residence, documenting everything. Yet for every piece of evidence found, more questions seemed to emerge. Was the positioning of certain items intentional? Was there a message in what appeared normal, or was the apparent order a facade masking something more sinister? Consider the psychological tension in such an environment. For family, friends, and investigators, walking through the home was not merely an exercise in fact-finding. It was a confrontation with ambiguity. Every familiar object, a movie poster, a family photo, a discarded note, could either confirm assumptions or undermine them entirely. And in this space, the silence was deafening. The quiet of the house became almost tangible, an oppressive weight pressing on everyone who entered. This is exactly the kind of silence Rob Reiner warned about in his final phone call, a silence that conceals as much as it reveals, that forces interpretation, and that can mislead even the most perceptive observer. The details of the home itself provide a fascinating, if unsettling, window into the Reiner's world. Rob was a filmmaker, a storyteller, a man whose life was steeped in narratives. Michelle was private but intelligent, attentive, and deeply connected to her family. Their home reflected these realities. It was organized yet lived in, elegant yet personal, public-facing yet intensely private. And within this duality lay the seeds of confusion. How could a space so carefully curated, a reflection of their lives, personalities, and habits, simultaneously conceal truths that were critical to understanding the events that transpired? Investigators noted several anomalies, details that seemed insignificant at first glance but took on weight in context. For example, certain items in the living area were out of place, not dramatically, but subtly. A misplaced chair, a book left open, a note not where one might expect it. Alone, each detail might have been dismissed. Together, however, they painted a picture that suggested someone had attempted, consciously or unconsciously, to communicate, to leave traces of meaning without explicitly stating anything. The interplay between what was present and what was absent is particularly striking. In any investigative scenario, absence can be as meaningful as presence. Missing items, gaps in routine, or unrecorded communications become puzzles in themselves. The Reiner residence was full of potential evidence, yet some of the most important aspects, the intangible elements of timing, behavior, and interaction, remained elusive. Friends and family have noted, in interviews and private discussions, that certain patterns of behavior in the days leading up to the tragedy seemed off. Perhaps unnoticed at the time, these subtle deviations now appear as part of a larger, more complicated narrative. One cannot discuss the house without touching on its atmosphere. Those who entered after the deaths often describe it as heavy, almost suffocating. The rooms were familiar but felt altered, infused with a tension that was invisible but palpable. This aligns with the concept of silence as warned by Rob Reiner. A space that appears calm and orderly can hide truths, fears, and intentions. And the Reiner home, despite its elegance and normalcy, became the stage for one of the most perplexing and chilling sequences of events in recent Hollywood history. Equally compelling is the role of the domestic staff and close associates. Many reported no unusual activity that day, yet others hinted at subtle oddities, changes in routine, minor disagreements, fleeting moments of tension that, in retrospect, may have been significant. It's in these nuances, the things that people initially ignore, that the house itself seems to speak. Investigators rely on such subtleties to reconstruct events, but for the public, these details remain largely speculative. And the tension between what is known, what is assumed, and what is hidden is precisely what fuels the ongoing fascination with the case. Family dynamics also play a role in interpreting the environment of the home. The presence of Nick Reiner, their son, is central to understanding interactions within the space. What was his relationship with his parents in these final hours? Were there signs of conflict or stress? Did Rob or Michelle exhibit behaviors that hinted at concern or forewarning? And most importantly, how does the environment, objects, notes, positioning, silence, reflect these dynamics? In a household with deep bonds and complex relationships, even small details carry outsized meaning. Another layer of intrigue comes from the public perception versus the private reality of the home. For the outside world, the Reiner residence was a symbol of Hollywood success, polished, orderly, seemingly untroubled. But inside, it became a microcosm of uncertainty, complexity, and concealed tension. This contrast is central to the story. Rob Reiner's final warning about silence takes on heightened significance when one considers the duality of appearances and reality, the way perception can be manipulated, and the danger of assuming that normalcy equals safety. Consider the items found in the home. Personal letters, journals, or even objects with sentimental value could hold insights into the emotional and psychological state of the Reiners. While authorities may not release these details, their presence adds layers of speculation. Were there clues hidden in plain sight? Messages meant for family but overlooked? Hints that something was amiss? The very act of searching a home in the wake of tragedy becomes a dialogue between the past and the present, between what was and what could have been. And yet, despite the meticulous investigation, the house remains a repository of unanswered questions. Every detail seems to demand interpretation, but no single explanation fits the complexity of the situation. Investigators, friends, and family alike confront the paradox, a space designed for clarity and comfort, yet transformed into a scene of mystery, tension, and doubt. The presence of objects, behaviors, and interactions simultaneously illuminates and obscures, offering fragments of understanding without resolution. In a sense, the house itself becomes a character in the narrative. Its walls, rooms, and objects interact with the people who enter, influencing perception, memory, and emotion. The silence that pervades the home is not merely absence of sound. It is presence, a force that shapes interpretation. Rob Reiner's warning about silence is mirrored in this environment. The more one searches, the more one realizes how deceptive appearances can be, how much remains concealed even in the most familiar spaces. Finally, it's important to acknowledge the tension between public curiosity and private investigation. While the media has reported extensively the full reality of the Reiner home, its nuances, its atmospherics, its silent communications, remains largely inaccessible. And that, perhaps, is the point. Silence, after all, is a tool. It can protect, mislead, or conceal. In the case of the Reiners, it has become central to the narrative, a haunting reminder that what is left unsaid or unseen can sometimes be the most revealing element of all. And so, as we leave the Reiner residence for the moment, one question remains: how much did the house itself reveal, and how much did it purposefully hide? The objects, behaviors, and silences inside were not merely backdrop. They were part of the story, subtle yet powerful, guiding investigators and observers alike toward questions that may never be fully answered. But what investigators didn't notice immediately, or perhaps were deliberately kept from noticing, would emerge in the days that followed, transforming a scene of quiet tragedy into a puzzle that challenged everything the public thought it knew. And the revelations that followed inside that house would shift suspicion, focus, and understanding in ways no one could have anticipated. What happens when tragedy intersects with suspicion? When grief is compounded by uncertainty, and the public narrative pivots on a single, shocking event? That moment came with the arrest of Nick Reiner, son of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Overnight, the story shifted from a shocking family death to a headline-grabbing legal drama. A twist that altered perception, inflamed speculation, and introduced new questions that would dominate headlines for weeks. The arrest itself was swift, precise, and calculated. Law enforcement sources reported that Nick Reiner was taken into custody shortly after authorities arrived at the Reiner residence. The reasons for the arrest remain officially undisclosed in detail, but public reporting indicates it was in connection with the deaths of his parents. In the span of hours, the lens of the tragedy focused intensely on him, turning what had been a story about loss and grief into one of potential culpability. To understand the impact of this arrest, we must first consider the context. Nick Reiner had largely remained out of the public spotlight prior to this event. Unlike his father, he was not a cultural figure, a filmmaker, or a public activist. He was, by most accounts, a private individual living a life removed from the constant scrutiny that accompanies Hollywood prominence. And yet, with the deaths of his parents, his name became the center of an intense investigation, a magnet for speculation, and a focal point of media attention. From a psychological perspective, the arrest transformed the narrative instantly. Suddenly, the public had a storyline that seemed simple: son arrested in connection with parents' deaths. But anyone familiar with high-profile cases knows that simplicity is rarely reality. There are layers, complexities, and unseen dynamics at play. Family relationships, personal history, and the subtle cues of behavior all come into focus when law enforcement intervenes. And for the Reiners, those dynamics had been hidden behind decades of privacy, creating a tension between what was visible and what remained concealed. Friends and associates of Nick Reiner have described him in conflicting ways. Some portray him as caring, attentive, and close to his parents. Others hint at tension, stress, or unspoken disputes. These contradictions make the arrest even more provocative. Was the arrest a result of evidence-based investigation, circumstantial inference, or an attempt to find clarity amid an ambiguous situation? Every detail, every phone call, every movement, every interaction became part of a complex puzzle that authorities and the public were compelled to piece together. The timing of the arrest also added to the sense of urgency and drama. Occurring so soon after the discovery of the bodies, it painted an immediate picture of involvement and potential motive. But the rapidity of action also sparked questions. Was there sufficient evidence to justify such a high-profile arrest? Or was it a necessary step in controlling the narrative, a measure to establish accountability amid uncertainty? These questions remain central to understanding how the story evolved and why public perception shifted so dramatically overnight. It is impossible to separate the arrest from the cryptic warning Rob Reiner left in his final phone call. "Don't trust the silence around it," suddenly takes on amplified meaning. Could this warning have been anticipating the very scenario that unfolded? Was Rob aware, in some intuitive or foreseeing way, that suspicion could turn toward his son? Or was the warning broader, a caution about perception, misinformation, and assumptions that can cloud judgment in the wake of tragedy? The ambiguity of the warning mirrors the ambiguity surrounding Nick Reiner's arrest. Media coverage of the arrest added yet another layer. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to sensationalist, and the framing often focused more on scandal than subtlety. Some reports emphasized the shocking nature of the event: a son arrested for the deaths of his famous parents. Others highlighted the procedural aspects: law enforcement following protocols, ensuring evidence collection, and securing statements. And in the background, the public tried to reconcile the image of Nick as a son with the reality of his arrest, a juxtaposition that fueled speculation and online debate. From a legal standpoint, the arrest marked the beginning of a complex investigation. Charges, evidence, and legal strategy would all unfold over weeks, potentially months. Every action, every statement, and every procedural step had consequences, both for Nick Reiner personally and for the broader narrative surrounding the deaths. But even as legal experts dissected protocols, the human dimension remained paramount. The emotional toll on family, friends, and the public grappling with grief, suspicion, and curiosity simultaneously. Adding to the complexity is the notion of motive. Publicly, motives remain unconfirmed. Observers are left to analyze patterns of behavior, family dynamics, and historical context. Were there tensions between Nick and his parents? Financial or personal disagreements? Or was the arrest entirely precautionary, based on procedural necessity rather than substantive evidence? Each hypothesis adds intrigue, but also reinforces the central theme of the Reiner case. Appearances can be deceiving, and silence may conceal more than it reveals. The arrest also forced a reevaluation of Rob Reiner's final warning. If his message hinted at hidden dangers or deceptive appearances, the arrest of his son became a real-world manifestation of that foresight. Suddenly, silence was no longer abstract. It was the space between public statements, private motives, and incomplete narratives. The phrase, "don't trust the silence around it," became a lens through which every new detail, every statement from authorities, every media report, every interaction between family members had to be interpreted. Moreover, the arrest catalyzed public debate about accountability, family dynamics, and the intersection of celebrity and private tragedy. Social media discussions, forum speculation, and opinion pieces debated whether Nick Reiner's arrest was justified, premature, or even necessary. The public, starved for answers, filled gaps in knowledge with conjecture. And in doing so, the arrest amplified the drama, tension, and emotional stakes surrounding the Reiner tragedy. Consider, too, the human element. For Nick Reiner, the arrest marked a turning point. A moment where private grief collided with public scrutiny and where personal trauma became a matter of national attention. For friends, family, and colleagues, it introduced shock, disbelief, and a desperate search for clarity. And for investigators, it created both opportunity and responsibility, the chance to uncover facts, but the burden of ensuring accuracy amid emotional and media pressures. Finally, the arrest reframed the entire narrative. The story was no longer only about tragedy. It became about suspicion, accountability, and the tension between perception and reality. Rob Reiner's warning about silence now resonated even more strongly, highlighting the dangers of taking events at face value. And for the public, the arrest created an unavoidable question. What did Rob Reiner know, foresee, or understand that the rest of the world did not? As the legal proceedings began and the investigation unfolded, the focus would shift repeatedly. From family dynamics to procedural details, from media scrutiny to private revelations. And yet, underlying it all was the same persistent tension, the silence that Rob had warned against, now made tangible by the arrest of his son. Every unanswered question, every ambiguous detail, every conflicting report became a thread in a complex web, one that demanded careful unraveling. But the arrest was only the beginning. What followed, revelations, interviews, and investigative discoveries, would continue to challenge assumptions, reveal contradictions, and expand the scope of the mystery. And those who thought the story had reached its climax were about to discover that the arrest of Nick Reiner was merely the spark that ignited a far larger, more complicated narrative. In tragedies like the Reiners, the sequence of events is often more revealing than any single piece of evidence. Every phone call, text message, and movement becomes a potential clue. Every pause, every delay, every interaction gains disproportionate significance. In the case of Rob and Michelle Reiner, investigators quickly realized that understanding the timeline was essential. The deaths themselves were shocking, but what happened in the hours, even minutes, leading up to that moment could hold the answers to questions the public hadn't even considered yet. The day in question began like any other Sunday, at least on the surface. Reports suggest that Rob and Michelle spent the morning engaged in routine activities, household maintenance, light social interactions, perhaps a walk or errands around the neighborhood. There were no immediate signs of distress reported by friends, family, or neighbors. Yet, in retrospect, the ordinary cadence of the day may have concealed subtle shifts, moments that now seem ominous. One critical element investigators focused on was Rob's final phone call. Placed hours before the deaths, the call serves as both a timestamp and a warning. "Don't trust the silence around it," he said. At the time, the words may have seemed cryptic, but within the context of the timeline, they suddenly take on chilling relevance. It suggests that something, or someone, was operating beneath the surface, something not immediately visible to those outside the house. Investigators reconstructed the evening meticulously, relying on a combination of digital records, surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence. Every action was logged, every movement mapped. From the moment Rob and Michelle last communicated with friends or family to when their bodies were discovered, there is a sequence of events that reveals both the predictability and unpredictability of human behavior in moments of crisis. Timing is everything. Consider, for example, the last verified sightings of Rob and Michelle. Family, neighbors, and acquaintances placed them at different locations within the house over the course of the afternoon. Certain behaviors, Rob stepping outside to check on a vehicle, Michelle moving between rooms, minor domestic tasks, all seem mundane. Yet, when juxtaposed with subsequent events, each ordinary action becomes loaded with potential meaning. Was there a signal in the routine? A subtle warning? A final attempt at communication? The arrival of investigators later that evening marked another crucial timestamp. Official records note when emergency services were contacted and when they arrived. These moments, measured in minutes, are essential for understanding the trajectory of the tragedy. Every delay, every interaction, and every procedural step is scrutinized for anomalies. And in a high-profile case like this, even the public release of these details can influence perception, speculation, and the ongoing narrative. Nick Reiner's whereabouts during the timeline are also central. Reports indicate that authorities placed him in proximity to the residence, but exact details remain partially undisclosed. Every reported interaction, phone calls, messages, or movements has been analyzed. Investigators are particularly focused on deviations from ordinary patterns. Did he leave the house? Did he interact with his parents in ways that could indicate conflict or distress? And how do these moments align with Rob Reiner's warning about silence? Digital evidence has played a critical role. Phone logs, messages, and timestamps provide a layer of objective data. They show when communications were made, when calls were answered, and when devices were inactive. In many high-profile cases, such digital breadcrumbs become essential to reconstructing events. They provide a framework within which investigators can test hypotheses, validate witness statements, and challenge or corroborate claims. Yet, even with these tools, gaps remain. There are moments, often brief, sometimes only a few minutes, where the actions of those involved are unaccounted for. These gaps are critical. They represent potential opportunities, interactions, or decisions that could shift the interpretation of the entire sequence. And these gaps are exactly the type of silence Rob warned against. Periods where absence of information can mislead, confuse, or obscure critical truths.